Let's go ahead and get started because we have a lot to talk about here. I'm Rabbi Micah Streiffer. I'm the director of Laasok, and I'm excited to welcome back my good friend and colleague, Rabbi Michael Satz, Rabbi of Congregation B'nai Or in Morristown, New Jersey. We are here for the second installment, second of two of this series on Judaism and democracy, ancient values for modern times. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's say the blessing for study together, and then Rabbi Satz is going to do a brief recap, and then we'll jump into some new texts. So if you'd like, you can unmute, and that way we can hear each other say the blessing together. And let's say together, Baruch atah Aknai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, tivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And that means in Hebrew, blessed is the eternal source of the universe, whose mitzvot, whose commandments make us holy, and who commands us to immerse, to engage in words of Torah. Rabbi Satz, do you want to give a recap from last week?
Yes. So last week, it was my honor to study with you verses from chapter 16 and 17 of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, where the Torah kind of sets up a system of government with different branches, with, we could even say, checks and balances. And we talked about this not to claim that the Torah was democratic, but to claim that the Torah does think about things that, democracies think about: power, balance, procedure, accountability to the people, things like that. And we had a great conversation about the king and the priests and the prophets and even and the judges and the people.
Nice recap. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm good at recaps. Yeah.
I know, it's a rabbinic skill to recap.
Mm-hmm.
It was a third-year course at HUC, how to recap what you did last week.
Right, exactly.
So this week we're going to shift into some later texts. We're going to look at some rabbinic texts, whereas last week we were focused on Torah, largely on Torah. And we're also going to shift somewhat away from institutions and toward questions around how does a society make decisions together? What does it mean to be a society together? And what is the meaning of truth in a society where decision-making rests in the hands of the people? And again, like last week, we look at this not in order to claim that the rabbis are democratic. They're not. But in order to, I think, explore the ways that the rabbis, and in this case, the rabbis' stories and thinking around decision-making has contributed to what we think of as democratic values, as the values of a society where decision-making rests, at least in some way, in the hands of the people. So we would love for you to participate. Raise your hands electronically, put notes into the chat, all of the above. Kind of like last week, we're gonna do the opposite. I'm gonna take the lead, and then Rabbi Satz is going to liberally break in with discussion and questions and things like that. And we invite you to do the same. Just please raise your hand so we can make sure that everybody who gets a chance to can talk. So, all right, I want to start with a story that many of you probably know. And this is the story of what's called the Oven of Aknai, which is also known as Rabbi Eliezer and the Flying Carob Tree. You might know it better by that name. I see some people shaking their heads. I have no idea what you're talking about. That's fine. So this is from Talmud Tractate Baba Metzia. And the rabbis here are discussing matters of community and decision making. And actually what we're really talking about here is a particular kind of oven. So the opening passage of this is going to describe this oven. This is an oven where the oven is separated into segments, and the segments are separated by sand. Now, the question, the ritual question that's being asked here, which only matters a little bit for our discussion, is the question of whether such an oven transmits impurity from one section to another. So if I put something impure into one section of the oven, and you put something pure into another section of the oven, then is the impurity transmitted from one section of the oven to the other? I know you all care deeply about matters of ritual impurity, which is why I mentioned this to you, but I think it's worth noting that in some way, at least in the background, this is a question about what it is to be a community, right? Is this oven a community enterprise or is it an individual enterprise? And that's the question that's being debated here. So we learn in a Mishnah that if one cut an earthenware oven widthwise into segments and placed sand into every segment, Rabbi Eliezer deems it pure. So Rabbi Eliezer tells us here that we're in the 2nd century. This is the time of the Tanaim. These are the rabbis about 100 or so years after the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Eliezer is a highly respected, well-known, extremely wealthy rabbi, and he's also known for not always agreeing with all the other ones. And we're going to see that here, that's exactly what happens. Rabbi Eliezer deems it ritually pure. He says that it doesn't transmit impurity from one section to another. And the rabbis deem it ritually impure. They say that it does. They say that this is a communal enterprise. If I put something impure in one section, it affects what you put in the other section. And this is known as the oven of Aknai. Now, nobody knows exactly what Aknai means. The Gemara, the Talmud asks, what does Aknai mean? The Aknai is something like a snake. In modern Hebrew, nachash is a snake. So why is this thing called the snake oven? And they have a couple of answers that I think we'll come back to. Rav Yehuda, these are later rabbis, says that Shmuel says it's because the rabbis surrounded it with their statements, with their arguments, like a coiled snake, and deemed it impure. So all that is the background to the story, and what we're told is that on that day, Rabbi Eliezer brings all the possible answers in the whole world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his opinions from him. So Rabbi Eliezer is in the minority here. He says one thing, he says it is pure, it doesn't transmit impurity. They all say it's impure, it does transmit impurity. And we are at a kind of a decision-making impasse here, where Rabbi Eliezer says one thing and everybody else says the opposite thing. So what happens next, and this is the famous part of the story that I think some of you might know, Rabbi Eliezer starts to call upon miracles. He says, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, then this carob tree will prove it. And what happens? The carob tree uproots itself, flies 100 cubits across the field, and replants itself. Some say 400 cubits. I like that. Even in that, we have a disagreement. The rabbis can't even agree on how far the carob tree flew. Either way, a miracle happens, and Rabbi Eliezer says, that shows that I'm right, but the rabbis say, nah, we do not cite proof from a carob tree. Then he says, okay, if I'm right, then the stream of water will prove it. And what happens? The stream of water turns backwards. It flows backwards. But once again, the rabbis are not buying it. We don't cite proof from a stream of water. Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. And the walls start to cave inward. But Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Yehoshua, his counterpart, his Ben Zug, his frenemy, I guess might be a good word for it, right, scolds the walls and says, butt out, walls. This is not your business. Sages are debating here. What do you have to do with it? And then something very interesting happens. The walls stop falling, but they don't go all the way back up. They stay inclined out of deference, we're told, to Rabbi Yehoshua and out of deference to Rabbi Eliezer. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer calls out the big guns and says, all right, if I'm right, heaven will prove it. And a bat kol, a divine voice, emerges from heaven and says, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? A halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place. In other words, a voice from the divine comes from heaven and says, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And Rabbi Yehoshua stands on his feet and quotes Torah back at the heavens and says, Lo bashamayim hi. It is not in heaven. So to how many of you is this story familiar? I see some hands going up. All right. Somebody tell me, just react to the story. What is the lesson? What is the message of the story here? And we can do that. I don't know what's in the chat. I haven't been looking at the chat. Or we can raise our hands if we'd like.
Yeah, I'll call on people just saying.
Go for it. Oh, I see Bob first, actually.
Yeah, so Bob, go ahead. Bob Hammer.
Hi there. This is a momentous moment for rabbinic control of the story. And they're completely showing that they're taking over here, and whether it's Eliezer or Yehoshua or whoever it is very clear that it's time, even though there's a quotation here from the Torah, it's time to move on from the Torah and listen to the preponderance of the rabbis in the study hall.
It's interesting. Bob, you say move. Sorry, Micah.
No, go ahead. I think we're going to say the same thing. So you say.
Yeah, Bob, you're saying moving on from the Torah. I see it not moving on from the Torah, but saying we interpret Torah. God doesn't interpret Torah.
Well, yeah, that's right. But we, the rabbis, have the freedom to impose our interpretation regardless of what exactly the Torah may say. So that's moving on.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's moving on from voices from heaven for sure. Right. It's moving on from the idea that God says what truth is. And we'll look in just a moment. It turns out they're arguing against somebody else who says that God does say what the truth is.
Right. Amy, you have your hand up.
Oh, there you go, Amy.
Yeah, right. Strikes me as a pretty healthy debate. They're trying to think everything through as completely as they can. They're having it hard, so somebody higher can show. And then they're debating about that too. It just strikes me as people trying to think through everything.
Yeah, I want to lift up the language of debate because that's already democratic language, right? Healthy debate is in a democratic society, a society which values people's opinions. Healthy debate is laudable. Healthy debate is good. A society that does not value people's opinions tries to quash debate. So that certainly is some of what's going on here.
So Micah, though, is Rabbi Eliezer having a healthy debate? Because he's not actually arguing anything. He's saying, I am right, and God agrees with me. Right?
And so as we'll see in the very next part of the story, the rabbis, that part of the issue here is that what the rabbis don't like about what Rabbi Eliezer is doing is his process, right? So the Gemara asks, and then Susan, I see you're next. What does it mean to say it's not in heaven? And Rabbi Yirmiyah, who again lives later, he's not there at the scene, he lives later. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we don't regard a divine voice. We're not listening to voices from heaven because God already wrote at Mount Sinai after a majority to incline. So there's a new process here, which is a process of debate and decision-making among people versus the one that Rabbi Eliezer was trying to use.
Can you talk about the verse that Yirmiyah is quoting from Exodus? How radical it is that he quotes that, or how he quotes that verse?
Hugely, yes. It's a really good. We don't have the verse here in front of us, but what he's doing here, what the rabbis are doing is actually they're taking this verse completely out of context, right? I mean, the verse actually originally says something like, "You shall not incline toward the wealthy or toward the powerful."
Right.
And the rabbis, what they do here is that, and this is to Bob's point, the rabbis are saying we get to decide what Torah means, even to the point where, they decide that Torah means something totally different than what Torah originally meant.
Exactly. So Susan's hands up, and then Bob Renard's hand.
Okay, thank you. I think I studied this once in Rabbi's Tish here recently. And if you could go back up to the walls leaning in for a second.
Sure.
I think that it's really quite miraculous that the walls start leaning inward, and that they didn't straighten because there was equal deference given to Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer because they remained leaning. And so whether there was a debate or an argument, this resolution is democratic. And then the part about it is not in heaven always reminds me of argument for the sake of heaven and not for the sake of heaven. And I'm wondering if this is what that is alluding to.
Yeah, that's a nice connection. No, that's alluding to a different story that if we have time, we'll get to at the end of this. As usual, I put together way too many texts for this 1 hour. But I think the idea of something being for the sake of heaven is good to insert here, because for the sake of heaven means that something is for the greater good, right? And so some of what the rabbis are doing here is they're suggesting that what is for the greater good, the decision for the greater good is the one made among the people, the one that reflects the will of the people in some way.
Right. And not necessarily what's dictated by God. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we had Bob next.
Yeah.
Bob Renard.
Bob Renard.
I always thought that this teaching was more about the issue of the Holy Blessed One saying, essentially, it's not about the argument, it's not about who's winning and losing, but that it's about freedom. It's about you have choice, you have freedom of choice. And so human beings decide now that Torah is here on the earth. Not that God is now going to say, this is who's right or wrong.
Yeah, it's about process, right? And in some,
I think that leads back to the walls just stopping halfway. In other words, a message there of like, there's no winners and losers. There is the struggle for truth.
I like that. Yeah.
Right. But we'll see if there's winners or losers in a minute. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, that's
what can we do one more? Lauren Davis has his hand up, and then
let me just hear, Lauren, before you speak, let me just, because this relates directly to what Bob was just saying, and then I think we'll move on to something that's a little different anyway. This is from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, what's called the Damascus document. The Damascus document is a text that was created probably by the Qumran sect, that sect of Jews that are sort of like an extreme, sort of a very extreme Jewish group existing only during the Second Temple period, the late Second Temple period. They were very likely a group of sort of like uber Sadducees, uber priestly kind of Jews. And some of what this gives us a sense of is that actually the rabbis are arguing directly with somebody who holds something different. So in their own texts, the Dead Sea sect writes that God raised up a teacher of righteousness. Nobody knows who the teacher of righteousness is, but it is the founding figure of the Dead Sea sect. So
right.
Notice first that God. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
And it's similar language to Deuteronomy, which we studied last week, that God will every once in a while raise up a prophet, right?
Right. Yeah, so God appoints this person, right? This leader is appointed by God. And then what happens? Well, God establishes the covenant with Israel forever, revealing to them hidden matters. So the Dead Sea sect and other groups among ancient Israel seem to believe that there was hidden knowledge in the heavens, and that God reveals that knowledge via certain people who get to speak for God. That's actually exactly what Rabbi Eliezer is doing. He's trying to reveal hidden knowledge in the heavens. The other rabbis, by saying lo bashamayim hi, it's not in the heaven, are actually taking for themselves and for humanity, or at least for the Jews, the ability to make these decisions. It's no longer about whether the oven is kosher or not because heaven says so. It's actually about what our community decides is the right answer within the context of our community. So I wanted to show you that, but now, Lauren, I know you had a hand up, so please.
I think it's interesting that we're seeing sort of a bifurcation here. We've been talking, and traditionally we talk about community in terms of prayer, in terms of what happens within the synagogue and how you do it. Here we're getting a different type of participation in more of a community activity. So we're talking about community. There's a community of prayer and religiousness, and then there's a community of actual interaction where the rabbis seem to be asserting the role of the democratic. They seem to be setting the role of, or the rule that it is a democratic type of the decision-making process. So I just think that's interesting, at least as I see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
No, I wanted to ask you, like, are the rabbis the people, or are they making decisions for the people, right? And what do they think they're doing?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question / point, maybe rhetorical question, because the rabbis very clearly are not the people, right? That's why this is not 18th century liberal democracy, right? This is not government for the people, by the people, and of the people, because the rabbis are themselves an elite, or at least they consider themselves to be an elite. And all over the Talmud, we see things like where the rabbis separate themselves from the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. They separate themselves from people, even the people of synagogues. Rabbis really see themselves as the people of the Beit Midrash, the people of the study hall, versus the people of the synagogue, which is like the common people. So I think that's an important distinction to make, and like we said last week, I don't think we can claim that the rabbis are small d Democrats, but they do seem to value a community making decisions for itself versus the idea that there is any one truth, or anybody, any one individual can speak for God.
Right. And God already spoke, and so we deal with what God spoke in the past, if you will, through what we have now, the textual evidence of that God speaking in the past. That's what we have to deal with, right?
Yeah.
And even if God speaks today, God's not supposed to. They're kind of saying.
Right. I mean, that's always the interesting part. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Are they saying that the voice isn't real? Rabbi Eliezer conjured the voice? Or is God actually speaking and the rabbis are saying, we're not listening anymore?
I think they're saying we're not listening anymore, because I think they're saying, you gave us the rules a while ago. We're playing by the rules and you're trying to change the game again. Or you're breaking the rules that you already set up at Sinai.
Yeah, so it's about structure, right? We're back to the question of decision-making institutions in a society.
Mm-hmm.
And even God doesn't have the power to assume all the power back for God's self, right? Even God doesn't get to be an autocrat in this system.
Right. And God's vote is through the text, not through voice.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I mean, that's where we didn't read this last paragraph, but the rabbis have this story about how, Rabbi Natan encounters Elijah the prophet and said, what was God doing when all this was happening? And Elijah smiles and said, oh, God was laughing and saying, Nitzachuni banai, my children have bested me. My children have defeated me or triumphed me. So God sort of defers to the institution, unlike some politicians we know, by way of saying, even my opinion must be explicated within the institutions that have been laid out here.
Right. It's kind of like, your kids have grown up, they're out of the house and they're making a living on their own, and they take the wisdom that hopefully you gave them, but they're off on their own, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to deepen that for a moment, we'll take a quick look at this text here, which is also from the Talmud, from Tractate Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is a court, and this is the tractate that deals with the workings of the courts. And what's described here is essentially a set of courts, circuit courts. They're not using exactly that language, but that's what is being described here, where a matter of dispute would make its way up through the courts, ultimately to a Supreme Court, a great Sanhedrin. But this all starts by saying that Rabbi Yossi teaches that originally there was no machloket in Israel, right? Lo hayu machlokot be'Israel. Originally, everybody agreed. So the rabbis assume that the reason for disagreement is actually a breakdown in knowledge. That's where I think we differ from them, right? We would suggest that, the reason for disagreement has to do with people's individual views and opinions and new knowledge that we keep gaining and bringing to our public discourse. The rabbis assume that in the beginning there was no disagreement. Everybody knew all the answers to everything, but disagreements arose, and so then we needed courts. And what they describe is a system of lower and higher courts where a matter will make its way through the courts. And in each court, it says if they heard a tradition, which is to say, if they had an answer that had been passed down through the generations, they would say it. And if not, it would go to a higher court. And what happens when you get to the highest court? The question was put before them. If they had a tradition thereon, they stated it, even the highest court. And if not, what does the highest court do? They took a vote. And if the majority voted unclean, impure, then they declared it so. And if the majority voted clean or pure, then they ruled it so. In other words, decisions even about what we might think of as absolute ritual matters, like something's either pure or impure, right? It can't be both. It's not, how could this be a matter of opinion? And yet, even a matter like that ultimately has to be decided within the institutions that are laid out here.
Right. And so it's kind of saying we could only approximate, we could take our best effort at approximating the truth.
Well, I think it raises an interesting question, which, would be worth discussing a little bit of, can there be, does the majority then just get to do whatever they want, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the majority decides something is true, like, for example, certain people shouldn't have basic rights because of their ethnic background, then does this kind of system leave us vulnerable to what they call the tyranny of the majority?
Right. Right.
Yeah, Bob, go ahead.
So the character of the members of the Great Sanhedrin or the others is very important, of course. And there's another place in this tractate where a rabbi, I forget who, describes the characteristics of members of the Sanhedrin. They have to be tall, good-looking, wise, understand 70 languages, be able to know sorcery, and understand 70 languages so that they never have to deal with listening to the words of translators.
Right. And there's somewhere else also, I think they have to be independently wealthy so that they don't take bribes. Right.
Right. They're assuming that people who are independently wealthy won't accept bribes of $400 million,
right. Yeah.
planes and things, right?
Right. But what is it? But what is it saying?
They were old. They have to also be old.
But you have to. But I think that means wisdom. They have to be virtuous and wise, I think.
But it's interesting that you raise that, Bob, because that sounds to me like a mythological person, right? It's easy to write that a couple hundred years later when you've never seen the actual Sanhedrin, right? This is the rabbi's idealized version of something that happened. And Aaron Shemesh, who's a scholar of ancient Judaism, suggests exactly that. He says, even if this description of the Sanhedrin is merely a myth, the fact that this is how the rabbis portray the process is enough because it reveals their own view concerning the ideal procedure for making decisions. This is very unlikely to have been how anything ever functioned in ancient Israel. But the rabbis are creating this structure in their minds of how decisions ought to be made. And they suggest that virtuous people ought to be making decisions through debate, discussion, and voting. and that is actually superior to anyone who claims to speak on behalf of God.
Right.
Ira put in the chat, I think I was asking about tyranny of the majority, right? And Ira said in the chat, no, that's why we have a constitution. Ira, is he still here? Ira, any chance you want to tell us more about that?
Well, I think you have, let's say the majority of people in the United States want to do something. 70% of them vote to do it, but it's unconstitutional. The framework of the Constitution says, no, it's not ruled. Everything isn't ruled by majority. We have a framework that can't be, and we do offenses around Torah and say, something's clearly in violation. Doesn't matter if the majority of people agree.
Right. So what do you think, Micah, would be the constraints on a majority vote within the Sanhedrin? What are the constraints saying that they can't just do whatever they want, right?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, the rabbis, I think, imagine, sort of paradoxically to what we just said, I think the rabbis imagine that God does have a will and that will is conveyed through Torah. You can tell me, Mike, if you think that is true or not. Like, they're not just voting for what they think is, for what they want. I think they think they're voting for what God intended.
Right. Or even back to our story, God intends for Eliezer to be right, or Eliezer to be right. But that God also intends for there to be a system of interpreting Torah, right? So they're weighing kind of two values, and they outvote God there. So here, the Sanhedrin can't just do whatever it wants, because they have to work within the system set out by the Torah. That's the Constitution, if you will, right? They can't say, someone says here, standard says they can't declare pigs to be kosher, right? They can't declare the Torah to be null and void, and that there's three gods instead of one, or something like that. So they do have a constitution, if you will, and ultimately, I think the check on them is that God is the king, God is the sovereign, not them, right? So it's a sense of there's a humility that's putting a check there too, right?
Yeah, which probably is some of the reason behind those requirements that Bob was enumerating earlier, right? These people are, at least in theory, are supposed to be people who will act for the public good.
Right.
Aristotle believed, or Plato believed that he was opposed to democracy. Plato believed that actually philosopher kings should be in charge. Spinoza thought something like this too, although he's more of a Democrat, that actually the people cannot be trusted to make decisions for themselves, that somebody wise needs to make decisions for the people, but not as a prophet, not as God speaking through them, but rather somebody who understands what's reasonable and what's good for the public, for the public. And the rabbis are kind of setting up something like that here with these people. But I think you're right that the Torah functions as a constitution here. So I'm glad that Ira raised that issue of the constitution, because the Torah for the rabbis is absolutely a constitution. And by the way, we should note that the rabbis created that idea. The Torah did not envision itself as a constitutional law document, but for the rabbis it is.
Although I was arguing a bit last week that Deuteronomy saw itself as kind of as like a constitution, right?
That's true. Yeah. In terms of institution. Okay, fine. I take it back.
But the rabbis are definitely codifying Torah and its interpretation as the constitutional tools of running the society, right?
For sure they are. Yeah. And as the way of, I mean, in much the same way that, Supreme Court justices today turn to the Constitution to justify a decision or a law, the rabbis do that with the Torah. And as we saw before, not always in ways that the Torah originally included. So, the rabbis are not strict constructionists when it comes to what the Torah is supposed to mean.
They're living constitutionalists, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah. Bob, go ahead. Oh, Bob, you're on mute.
Yeah, off of what you were just saying, our Constitution then has, courts and laws that can be made by Congress and so on. So there's over time, there's all these precedences, so to speak, that are added. And I think it's the same thing when I think about Torah and the ongoing process of argument, debate, decision making, that there are all these new ornaments of truth that somehow are added as things go along, that then I think would provide balance. So in the eyes perhaps of the Holy Blessed One, that having those precedences and putting those together then leads to a more balanced notion of what's good for all.
Right. Good. Yeah. Back to the text you taught, Micah, from Sanhedrin there, that they couldn't, voting was not the first thing you jump to. The first thing you jump to is a precedent from before, right? And so that's also a check on rabbinic power, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We don't have it in front of us anymore, but yes, that it says, if they heard of a decision, and to hear shamua in rabbinic parlance means to have something handed down. So for the rabbis, precedent actually trumps almost all else. If they have a decision from an earlier set of rabbis, then they'll go with that. That might be a difference between them and us as progressives, as people who believe in, in sort of like a progressive, a progression of knowledge. We would actually not necessarily uphold an earlier decision if there's something that proves it wrong.
Right.
Same-sex marriage is a great example. Science has taught us new things, and I say this both from a legal and from a religious perspective. Science has taught us new things about human sexuality and sexual orientation and things like that, which for me as a progressive Jew and as a basically progressively, politically progressive person, means that earlier attitudes are wrong. Science shows that they're wrong. The rabbis believe in precedent, I think, in a way that that might be different from how we would approach it.
Again, because the past generations were closer to Sinai, if you will.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, because they believe, it's like what we were looking at before, that in the beginning there was no machloket, there was no disagreement, everybody knew the answers. The disagreements for them are the result of people forgetting versus the disagreements being the result of new information coming in. And that's why the rabbis are not progressives, even though they might believe in voting.
Right.
So let's turn, we have 20 minutes left. I'm trying to decide what to do here. Let's turn to the second half of the Oven of Aknai story. So we saw that we often stop it there, like the rabbis, Rabbi Yehoshua wags his finger at heaven and says, God, get out. And God's like, yeah, you win. My children have bested me. But then it takes a kind of a dark turn where Rabbi Eliezer is excommunicated. He's put in cherem from the community because of his adherence to this old system where he claims to speak for heaven. So the sages take all the ritually pure items that he had deemed and they burn them in a fire. And this is the sort of the dark, scary part of the story, where the rabbis cut out Rabbi Eliezer because he's not willing to play by the rules of the game, which is to say that decisions are made here on earth, and then they ostracize him. They put him in a cherem, which in that world meant that no one was to talk to him, do business with him. He was no longer part of the religious, the Jewish community. Certainly no longer part of the rabbinic community, and in theory not part of the Jewish community either. This same thing happens to Spinoza in the 16th century, 17th century, because of him holding views that were seen as anathema to Judaism and to the community that he was part of. And when Rabbi Eliezer is told this, he dropped to his seat and sat upon the ground. His eyes shed tears, and as a result, the entire world was afflicted. A third of the olives were afflicted, and a third of the wheat, and a third of the barley. And some even say that the dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer's great anguish over being separated from his community brings the world to a kind of a screeching halt. It's a cosmic event that the rabbis have done this. And Rabban Gamliel, who's the head of the Sanhedrin at this time, he's traveling in a boat, and because of all this stuff going on, he gets in the middle of a storm. This presumably is the emotional storm created by Rabbi Eliezer's anguish from being excommunicated. And Rabban Gamliel says, he calls out to God and he says, here it is, Master of the universe, you know that it was not, there's a typo here, it was not for my honor that I acted, nor was it for the honor of the house of my father that I acted by excommunicating Rabbi Eliezer. Rather, it was for your honor. God, I did this for your sake, so that disputes will not proliferate in Israel. The sea calmed from its raging. So there's actually something a little bit paradoxical here, because the rabbis excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer because he claims absolute truth, but then they do so because they're afraid that Rabbi Eliezer's claim to absolute truth will actually create division among the people. So the rabbis wish to institutionalize a system where people can debate and discuss and be in a community together, rather than one where someone like Rabbi Eliezer can claim absolute truth. And then what happens if I claim to have the absolute truth and you claim to have the absolute truth? Then we can't talk to each other anymore. There's no conversation to be had between us anymore.
Right. It's like we have to take, in most matters, we have to take truth with a capital T off the table so that we can have a conversation about truth, right?
Yeah, I'm curious how this sits with people, because in some ways, I think what they're describing, what they're afraid of here, is exactly what's happening in American society right now, where like you can't sit down around the Thanksgiving table with your Trump voting relatives, right? Or, where people just, you can't even talk to each other because they claim to have the absolute truth and I claim to have the absolute truth. And what happens, you can't be in a community together anymore.
Right. So Doreen has her hand up.
I don't have an answer for this, or I just thought when you were talking about truth, if everything is relative, how successful is a society or a faith?
Right, right. Yeah, so that what's the flip side of this is that it can be dangerous too. Absolute truth is dangerous and relativity is dangerous.
Yeah. So how do you balance then? How do you balance the notion that, I disagree with you fundamentally. I think what you're doing is wrong. I think it's immoral. And yet we have to somehow be a society together. And I think we somehow, and Doreen, you said you don't know the answer. If we knew the answer, then we would, implement it, and things would look very different. But I think that's exactly the challenge, is how do you live in a world where somebody else can be really, really wrong, and yet we can still talk to each other? Or as it says in a later text here, the students of Hillel and Shammai did not refrain from marrying each other's daughters, right? In other words, they were a community together. This is Hillel and Shammai versus Eliezer and the rabbis, but they somehow managed to maintain a sense of being part of one community despite disagreeing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I see Ira and I see Bob.
Yeah.
I was wondering if I noticed that Seth had written something in the chat. If you could expand on that, or
Sure. So
about your sponsor.
Yeah, so Rabbi Seth Stander says, remember though that responsa over time demonstrate rabbinic innovation in the face of evolving local/regional practices. Rabbi Stander, are you able to unmute? Do you want to tell us more what you meant by that?
Yes, I can. And how's everybody doing today?
Doing great.
Glad you're here.
Good, good. The reality of responsa literature, or what we know in Hebrew as she'elot utshuvot, questions and answers, very often is that a local community or a region has embarked on a new practice and are seeking rabbinic justification for said practice. And the rabbis are interested in keeping those communities in the overall fold, shall we say. And therefore, they're going to go ahead and do some rather creative interpretation of text and tradition in order to permit that which has already occurred. What we know as b'diavad, something that has happened after the fact. If they were asked ahead of time, l'chatchila, they may very well come up with reasons to be more strict in their interpretation. But b'diavad, they're looking to go ahead and to justify that which has happened in their absence. This has been a practice that has led to such innovations as the creation of what is now the modern reform movement itself, which was lay-driven in the halls of seasoned Germany and other locations well before rabbis were involved. And only later did we begin to see not only rabbinic embracing of this ideal, but also the innovations that led to rabbinic leadership of what became the standard movements that we identify today.
Yeah, thank you for that. Seth, how do you balance, or anybody, how do you what I'm hearing you talk about is sort of the notion that Judaism evolves through practice, right? People develop practices and then we go back and we justify them. And, rightly or wrongly, through recourse to the text, I think we're seeing the rabbis do that exact thing here. And I wonder, to some extent, I think the logical extreme that people just American now, right? That people decide it. So I guess balance that with you that there are sort of constitutional values that a society has to uphold.
So, Micah, I don't know if it just froze for me or for everyone else.
I think it's for everyone.
Yeah. So you were being brilliant until you froze, and so if you don't mind repeating a little bit or summarizing what you were just sharing.
I think what I was asking was, how do you balance this idea that, Judaism or any way of life evolves as the people evolve, which means that actually the people get to choose what Judaism looks like. Dr. Shia Cohen says, for the historian, Judaism is what the Jews do, right? That's what Judaism, and Mordechai Kaplan said the same thing. Reconstructionist Judaism, essentially believes that Judaism is the revolving religious civilization of the Jews. Where we go, Judaism goes. And I guess I think the danger then is this idea of tyranny of the majority, that how do you balance that against the idea that there are sort of central constitutional values in America or in Judaism or in Israel, and that the people don't just get to decide what's true and what's right?
Well, I would say, if I could jump in for a second, like a traditional, quote, traditional way of thinking about it, which, as a liberal Jew, I would not think about it this way, but as a traditional rabbi, let's say, even if they're making a decision b'diavad, after the fact to make what the people are doing kosher, they're still they may know in their heart they're doing that, but what they're publicly doing is still using the constitutional system, if you will, rather than just saying this is the right thing to do because we're living in a liberal society or whatever, right? They're saying this is what Torah is allowing for in this specific time, right?
I think that's well said. And I would add in just a wonderful common folk teaching that comes from rabbinic literature, which is if your wife is short, incline your ear so as to hear what she is saying, to paraphrase the teaching. And the idea behind it is not just good relations between spouses, but the idea is ultimately to incline your ear towards people who may perceive themselves to not be fully heard and seen. Especially by people who are perceived to be in positions of power and authority. Because we derive our power and authority, especially in the centuries since the rabbinate was professionalized, by the people who elect to study with us and engage us in sacred task. So it is in many ways a symbiotic relationship as opposed to a hierarchical one that allows us to evolve even more effectively than in previous generations how we can read and reread from seminal text such as Tanakh into apocryphal literature and then into rabbinical literature, agadic and halachic, the story and the legal, and say, this is what the people desire in this day and age. And we connect it to a teaching that comes ultimately from Sinai.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and that, by the way, is why republicanism is a form of democracy. I often hear this idea that, we're a republic, not a democracy. But people who represent people are, in theory at least, representing their constituencies. They need to incline their ears. And I like what you said, Rabbi Stander, that this is particularly about the vulnerable, right? And, a society that is not caring for its vulnerable or hearing the voices of its vulnerable is exactly what the ancient prophets are regularly suggesting is not acceptable to God and to Judaism.
The last thing I'll add, because I realize I just sort of jumped on in there after your question, is the old phrase that very often is heard in nonprofit and in congregational life: budgets are value statements.
For sure.
Yeah, that could be a whole class in and of itself. Maybe we'll do that one next. Let's go to the Bobs, Bob Hammer and Bob Renard, and then I have one last text to show you.
I would like to go back to the story of Rabban Gamliel in the boat. And I think that may show us a way to talk to our people from the other political divide across the Thanksgiving table. Because here you have two individuals who are like at the top of their power. I mean, Rabbi Gamliel was the head of the thing at Yavne. And after all, it was God that he was interacting with. I mean, this is like the peak thing, and yet they could communicate. And yet Rabbi Gamliel was able to say the right thing that even enabled God in his anger or whatever exactly it might have been to calm down. So if they could do it, maybe we can do it.
Nice, thank you. Bob Renard, please.
I found it kind of interesting that, it starts with that whole process of everything being burned. Okay, so it's so dramatic to us here as moderns. But, if you think about it, burning something, it's transitioning. It's going into something. It's going into smoke and water and vapors and so on. And it's going to come out. It's still there. And so I think the way this teaching goes to then talk about, the dough is spoiling in the woman's hands, that there are all these wide-ranging, part of the crop of wheat is lost. So in other words, it goes back to, I think, what Rabbi Stander was saying, we have to consider the wide-ranging ideas. So if a community decides on this being the truth, I think also there needs to be some kind of what's the long range, the wide ranging effects of that particular decision on the whole of the community. And I think that then when Rabbi Gamliel is out there and he's like, I think, this water may take me, goes back to the basic, I did this for the best I could figure for all. And so it's not so much that God is saying, okay, you're right. It's more like God is saying, yeah, that's probably the best we can ever do, is to get back to the basic and then try to move, and I think that's waters settle.
Right. So both Gamliel and God are showing humility, right?
Well, actually, that's a really good segue into the last thing that I wanted to show you, which is another one of those famous stories. This is the one that Susan brought up earlier about the dispute for the sake of heaven. The rabbis ask, what is a dispute that is not for the sake of heaven? And they say, Korach, which I know is Susan's favorite Torah portion, which we won't look at right now. And what is a dispute that is for the sake of heaven? They say it's a dispute, the dispute between Hillel and Shammai. And here's the story that they tell about that. Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, for 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. We're in the 1st century BCE here, like right around the year 0. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are 2 houses, sort of theoretically Pharisaic or like proto-rabbinic houses of thought, and they disagree. It doesn't matter what they disagree on. They disagree on something. Both of them say we're right. Halakha is in accordance with our opinion. No, the halakha is in accordance with our opinion. There's nothing new under the sun. People argued about a lot of things back then also, and they claimed to be right. Ultimately, a divine voice emerged from heaven. This is the same as before. This time, the divine voice we're going to listen to, because it's not going to pick a side, except in the ways that it is. The divine voice proclaims, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and those are the words of the living God. Right? So that's the voice's message, is that actually God agrees with both of you. These are both the words of the living God, but the halakha is in accordance with Beit Hillel. In other words, you're both right, but Hillel wins. It's kind of like in Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Well, you're both right, but Hillel is righter. So the Talmud asks the understandable question, how could that be the case? If they're both right, how can Hillel be righter? And the answer they give, the reason is that they were agreeable and forbearing. In other words, it was about their demeanor toward others. They teach both their own statements and the statements of Beit Shammai. In fact, they prioritize the statements of Beit Shammai to their own statements. So what makes them right? First of all, there's some kind of a recognition here that communities have to create standards, communities have to make decisions. You can't just, they say everybody can't just make their own Shabbos, right? There has to be a law. There has to be a decision about communal standards. In some cases, like we liberal Jews would suggest that actually in some way everybody can make their own Shabbos, but there is a limit to that. We can't just all do what we want and still be a community together. So in the end, Beit Hillel the halakha has to follow somebody. But the reason the halakha follows Hillel is not because they are righter, but rather because of the way that they engage in the process, the way that they approach the process. And the really important thing I think here is the part where they teach their own statements and the statements of Beit Shammai. In order to teach the statements of Beit Shammai, you know what they have to do? They have to listen. They have to actually ask questions, approach their opponents with curiosity and humility, and ask, why is it that you believe the thing that you believe? And I have to say, I think, that is something that's sorely lacking from our society these days. I think, to be able to understand why the other side believes what they believe, rather than simply believing that the other side is somehow irrational or incapable of higher thought or evil, right? You think, we could apply this to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well, to ask, why did someone do something unconscionable? We like to say, it can't be contextualized, but actually everything happens in a context. And the Jewish tradition here is ultimately trying to exhort us to approach with humility and curiosity the person that does not agree with you, not because they're right, but because that's the only way to actually have a conversation. So with that, I think we have to end. Rabbi Satz, any last words?
No, I can't do it better than you did.
So I want to say thanks to Rabbi Satz and to all of you for being here. Thanks to B'nai Ora for partnering on this this 2-part series. This has been really interesting, and I've really appreciated everything that all of you brought. I'm really glad to have our colleague Rabbi Seth Stander with us here as well this week. Seth, thanks for what you brought to the discussion. Next week, we are back to Tikva through text, same time, same Zoom link. I hope those of you who were new will continue to join us because we have really wonderful conversations every week. And with that, I'll say goodbye and thank you and an early Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good Lag BaOmer.